Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is complaining about a speeding ticket. Meanwhile, history is full of people who got their heads chopped off for wearing glasses, making eye contact, or letting their shadow fall in the wrong direction. Today, we're counting down 33 real executions so stupid, you'll question how humanity made it this far. These aren't legends or exaggerations. Courts actually sentenced people to death for these reasons. Let's go. 1. Thomas Cromwell was one of the most powerful men in England. He was King Henry VIII's right-hand guy, the fixer, the man who made things happen. And what ultimately got him killed? A bad Tinder match. Okay, not exactly, but close enough. Henry needed a new wife, and Cromwell arranged a marriage to Anne of Cleves based on a flattering portrait. When Anne showed up looking nothing like her picture, Henry was furious. He called her a Flanders mare and blamed Cromwell for the whole disaster. Now, was it entirely Cromwell's fault? Absolutely not. Was he also caught up in court politics and accused of treason? Sure, but the spark that lit his funeral pyre was essentially catfishing the king. In 1540, Cromwell lost his head because Henry VIII got catfished. Let that sink in. 2. Ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and apparently, the most aggressive anti-laziness laws in human history. Around the 7th century BC, a lawmaker named Draco created a legal code so harsh that we still use the word draconian today. And among his greatest hits was this gem. If you were caught being idle, meaning you had no job and no visible means of support, you could be executed. Not fined, not jailed. Executed. The Athenians basically invented the death penalty for unemployment. Imagine getting hauled before a court because you spent too many days hanging around the Agra, and the judge sentences you to death for being a bum. Draco's laws were eventually reformed because, shockingly, people realized killing citizens for laziness might be a bit excessive. But for a while there, napping in Athens was a life-threatening activity. 3. In ancient Polynesia, specifically places like Tahiti and Hawaii, chiefs weren't just leaders. They were considered divine, walking gods among mortals. And their power was protected by a concept called mana, a sacred spiritual force that could be violated in ways you'd never expect. One of the most dangerous? Shadows. If a commoner's shadow accidentally touched the shadow of a chief, it was considered a catastrophic spiritual violation. The punishment was death, often immediate decapitation. Think about that for a second. You're walking along, minding your own business, the sun shifts slightly, and boom, your shadow grazes the chief's shadow. Congratulations! You just committed a capital offense with your silhouette. No trial, no appeal, just a very sharp blade. It's the ultimate wrong place, wrong time scenario, except the wrong place was literally anywhere near sunlight and royalty. 4. Admiral John Byng was a British naval officer who, in 1756, failed to defeat the French at the Battle of Minorca. Now, failed is doing a lot of heavy lifting here because Byng didn't run away or surrender. He fought, assessed the situation, and decided a tactical retreat was smarter than losing his entire fleet. The British government disagreed, spectacularly. Byng was court-martialed, convicted of failing to do his utmost, and sentenced to death. The court actually recommended mercy, but King George II refused. Byng was shot by firing squad on his own ship. The French philosopher Voltaire later wrote that the British killed Byng to encourage the others. And that's not sarcasm. That was literally the point. Win gloriously or die trying. Because apparently living to fight another day was a capital crime. 5. In medieval Europe, falconry wasn't just a hobby. It was a status symbol, a way to flex your noble bloodline without saying a word. And because the aristocracy really didn't want commoners having nice things, laws were created to restrict who could own hunting birds. In some kingdoms, possessing a hawk or falcon without proper noble standing was punishable by death. Imagine being a peasant who finds an injured falcon, nurses it back to health, and then gets executed for it. The crime wasn't theft. It wasn't violence. It was simply owning a bird above your social station. The logic was that hunting birds were reserved for nobility, and a commoner with a hawk was essentially pretending to be better than they were. Nothing says secure in my power like killing people over bird ownership. 6. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was famously paranoid. And honestly, when you've got that many enemies, maybe paranoia is just good planning. But his fear of assassination led to some truly unhinged rules, including this one. Looking directly at the emperor could get you killed. Not threatening him, not insulting him, just making eye contact. The idea was that only someone plotting harm would dare to gaze upon the divine ruler. So everyone in the imperial court spent their time staring at the floor, terrified that one accidental glance upward would be their last. Imagine the stress of being a servant in that palace. You're carrying a tray of food, you trip, you look up instinctively, and suddenly you've committed treason with your eyeballs. No wonder his tomb needed all those terracotta warriors. Real ones kept getting executed. 7. Medieval English kings had a recurring problem with football. Not because they hated sports, but because they hated anything that distracted men from archery practice. Football games were chaotic, violent mob events that sometimes turned into riots, and monarchs worried they were basically training grounds for rebellion. So kings like Edward II and Edward III banned the sport entirely, with punishments ranging from imprisonment to, in some extreme interpretations, death. The logic was that young men kicking a ball around weren't practicing their bow skills, and England needed archers, not athletes. So if you were caught playing football, you weren't just a troublemaker. You were a threat to national security. It's possibly the only time in history when go outside and play could get you killed. Medieval England, where your hobby could literally be a capital offense. 8. In 18th century London, wigs weren't just fashion, they were investments. A high-quality wig made from human hair could cost more than a working-class person earned in a year. Naturally, this made them targets for theft, and a whole criminal underclass of wig snatchers emerged. These thieves would run up behind wealthy pedestrians, grab their wigs, and disappear into the crowd. The response from British law? Death. Under the so-called Bloody Code, stealing a wig was classified as a capital offense. You could literally be hanged for snatching someone's hairpiece. The streets of Georgian London were apparently so dangerous that your fake hair needed protecting by threat of execution. It's fashion policing taken to its most extreme, lethal conclusion. Today we have hat thieves. Back then, they had executioners waiting for anyone who touched the wrong powdered wig. 9. In 1634, Tsar Mikhail Romanov of Russia decided that tobacco was evil. Not bad for your health evil, but corrupting the soul of the nation evil. So he did what any reasonable autocrat would do. He banned it completely and made selling or smoking tobacco punishable by death. People caught with tobacco could be tortured, have their nostrils slit, or be executed outright. The reasoning was a mix of religious condemnation and fear that tobacco houses were breeding grounds for dissent. Imagine being a merchant who just wanted to sell some imported leaves, and suddenly you're facing the executioner's axe. Russia eventually lifted the ban when Peter the Great came along and realized there was money to be made in taxing tobacco instead of killing people over it. But for decades, a cigarette in Moscow was basically a death wish. 10. Ancient Babylon took beer very seriously. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written legal codes in history, included specific laws about tavern keepers and their product quality. And one law stands out as particularly brutal. If a tavern keeper was caught watering down beer or overcharging customers, the punishment was drowning. That's right, death by the very liquid you use to cheat people. There's a poetic justice to it, sure, but also a terrifying commitment to consumer protection. Babylonians apparently valued their beer so much that defrauding drinkers was considered worthy of capital punishment. No refunds, no lawsuits, just a one-way trip to the river. It makes modern health inspections look downright gentle. So next time you complain about a weak drink at a bar, just be grateful the bartender isn't facing execution for it. 11. In ancient Rome, purple wasn't just a color, it was power made visible. Tyrian purple dye, extracted from sea snails, was so expensive and labor-intensive to produce that only the wealthiest could afford it. Eventually, emperors decided that purple was exclusively theirs. Wearing it without imperial permission was considered treason, punishable by death. This wasn't just about fashion snobbery. Purple symbolized divine authority, and wearing it implied you were claiming that authority for yourself. So if you were a Roman citizen who happened to find a purple cloak at the market and thought it looked nice, congratulations, you just committed a capital offense. One wrong wardrobe choice, and you're facing execution. It's the most extreme dress code violation in history, proving that in Rome, what you wore could literally determine whether you lived or died. 12. Oliver Cromwell led the forces that executed King Charles I and ruled England as Lord Protector. When he died in 1658, he was given a grand state funeral. But then the monarchy was restored, and Charles II wanted revenge. The problem? Cromwell was already dead. Solution: dig him up and execute him anyway. In 1661, Cromwell's corpse was exhumed, dragged through London, hanged at Tyburn, and then beheaded. His head was stuck on a pole outside Westminster Hall, where it remained for over 20 years. The man had been dead for 3 years, but apparently, that wasn't enough. They needed to kill him again, posthumously. It's the ultimate petty political revenge, proving that even death couldn't save you from the wrath of a restored monarchy. Cromwell literally couldn't rest in peace. 13. When the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in 1975, they launched one of history's most brutal social experiments. Their goal was to create an agrarian utopia by eliminating anyone connected to the old society, including intellectuals. And how did they identify intellectuals? By looking for anyone wearing glasses. The logic, if you can call it that, was that glasses meant you could read, and reading meant education, and education meant you were an enemy of the revolution. Thousands of people were executed simply because they had poor eyesight. Doctors, teachers, and anyone who looked remotely educated were targeted. It's a chilling reminder that ideology can turn something as innocent as corrective lenses into a death sentence. The Khmer Rouge killed nearly 2 million people, and for some, the crime was literally just seeing the world more clearly. 14. Emperor Tiberius of Rome was paranoid to the point of absurdity. Among his many fears was the idea that someone might disrespect his image, which was stamped on coins and carved into rings throughout the empire. So he made a rule: bringing any object bearing his likeness into a bathroom or brothel was treason. The reasoning was that bodily functions near his sacred image were an insult to his divine authority. People were actually executed for accidentally walking into a latrine while carrying a coin in their pocket. Imagine being condemned to death because you forgot to empty your wallet before using the toilet. It's micromanaging taken to a homicidal extreme. Tiberius turned bathroom breaks into potential capital crimes, proving that Roman emperors could find treason in literally anything, including your bladder schedule. 15. After the Jacobite uprising in 1746, the British government was determined to crush Scottish Highland culture. They banned tartans, kilts, and Gaelic. And then there was James Reid, a piper who was arrested and put on trial. His crime? Playing the bagpipes. The court ruled that the bagpipes were an instrument of war, meaning that carrying one was the same as carrying a weapon. Reid was convicted of bearing arms against the crown and sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1746 for playing music. Not fighting, not spying, not plotting rebellion. Just blowing into a bag and making noise. It's the only recorded instance of someone being executed for their choice of musical instrument. The British literally killed a man because they found bagpipes threatening. And honestly, have you heard bagpipes at 7 in the morning? Still not a reason for execution, though. 16. Giles Corey was an 81-year-old farmer caught up in the Salem witch trials of 1692. When accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea, knowing that if convicted, his property would be seized from his family. So the court tried to force a plea out of him using a method called pressing. They laid him on the ground and piled heavy stones on his chest, demanding he speak. For 2 days, Corey endured the crushing weight. According to legend, His only words were, "More weight." He died without ever entering a plea, protecting his family's inheritance through sheer, stubborn silence. Corey was literally crushed to death for refusing to talk. It's one of history's most defiant deaths, a man who chose to be slowly flattened rather than give his persecutors the satisfaction of a word. Silence was his weapon, and he paid for it with his life. 17. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a bloody uprising in England, and the rebels weren't just angry at the nobility. They were angry at anyone who represented the upper class, including anyone who spoke French. At the time, French was the language of the English court and aristocracy. So the rebels developed a simple test. They'd force people to say bread and cheese in English. If you pronounced it with a French accent or couldn't say it at all, you were identified as an enemy and killed on the spot. It was a linguistic death sentence, a medieval accent check with fatal consequences. Foreigners and nobles alike were butchered because their tongue betrayed them. Imagine being a French merchant in London, your only crime being that you couldn't properly pronounce two simple English words. It's xenophobia weaponized into instant execution. 18. During the medieval period, mathematics was viewed with deep suspicion by many in the church and general population. Numbers, calculations, and especially algebra, which came from the Islamic world, seemed like dark magic to people who couldn't understand them. Some mathematicians were accused of sorcery simply because their work appeared to conjure answers from thin air. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. If you could manipulate symbols and predict outcomes, you must be communicating with demons. Several scholars faced persecution, and some were executed for practicing what we'd now call basic arithmetic. It's the ultimate anti-intellectual crime, being killed because you were too good at solving problems. Imagine explaining to an executioner that you're not summoning spirits, you're just calculating interest rates. The medieval world wasn't just bad at math, it was apparently willing to kill people over it. 19. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, governed the Mongol Empire with strict rules that often carried death sentences for seemingly minor offenses. One of the strangest, washing clothes or bathing in a river during a thunderstorm. The Mongols believed that storms were controlled by powerful spirits, and polluting water during such a sacred event would anger these forces, potentially bringing disaster upon the entire tribe. So if you were caught doing laundry when lightning flashed, you could be executed for endangering everyone's spiritual safety. It's environmental protection through terror, making sure no one messed with the weather gods. Imagine being a Mongol traveler who just wanted clean clothes, and suddenly you're facing death because the sky rumbled at the wrong moment. The Yasa had many brutal laws, but this one stands out for punishing people based on meteorological timing. 20. Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire had many obsessions, but his hatred of coffee was legendary. He believed that coffee houses were breeding grounds for sedition, places where men gathered, gossiped, and plotted against the throne. So in the 17th century, he banned coffee entirely and personally enforced the prohibition. Murad would disguise himself and wander the streets of Istanbul at night. If he caught anyone drinking coffee, he would execute them on the spot, sometimes with his own sword. The Sultan reportedly killed thousands over this obsession. It's the most extreme anti-caffeine campaign in history, a ruler so paranoid about rebellion that he turned coffee breaks into death sentences. Today, Istanbul is famous for its coffee culture. Back then, ordering a cup could cost you your head. 21. During the French Revolution, fashion became political. The revolutionaries called themselves sans-culottes, meaning without knee breeches, because they wore long trousers instead of the silk knee-length pants favored by aristocrats. Wearing culottes, those aristocratic breeches, marked you as a potential enemy of the revolution. And during the Reign of Terror, that could mean the guillotine. People were denounced, arrested, and executed partly based on their clothing choices. Imagine standing before a revolutionary tribunal, and your crime is essentially wearing the wrong pants. The revolution devoured its enemies, and sometimes those enemies were identified by nothing more than their trousers. It's class warfare expressed through fashion, where your wardrobe could determine your fate. The guillotine didn't care what you believed, only what you were wearing when they came for you. 22. In totalitarian regimes, loyalty isn't just expected, it's performed. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, North Korea mandated public mourning. Citizens were required to cry, wail, and show extreme grief. Those who didn't cry hard enough or whose tears seemed insufficiently sincere could be reported, arrested, and in some cases, sentenced to labor camps or worse. Similar dynamics existed when Kim Jong-il died in 2011. State monitors watched crowds for anyone whose grief appeared fake or half-hearted. Your survival literally depended on your acting skills. It's emotional policing taken to its most terrifying extreme, where not crying convincingly could destroy your life. The state demanded not just obedience, but genuine-seeming emotion on command. And if you couldn't produce tears for a leader you might have secretly despised, you faced severe punishment. Grief became a survival skill. 23. When the Manchu conquered China and established the Qing dynasty in 1644, they imposed a hairstyle on the population, the queue. All men had to shave the front of their heads and grow a long braid in the back. The slogan was brutally clear: keep your hair and lose your head, or lose your hair and keep your head. Refusing to adopt the queue was considered rebellion and punished by execution. Thousands were killed for simply wanting to keep their traditional hairstyles. It wasn't about fashion. It was about submission. The queue was a visible mark of Manchu dominance, and refusing it meant refusing foreign rule. Imagine choosing death over a haircut, and yet many did, seeing the queue as a humiliation worse than execution. It's one of history's bloodiest dress code enforcements, where your hairstyle was literally a matter of life and death. 24. In 1812, Britain was in the grip of industrial revolution, and a movement called the Luddites was smashing the machines they believed were stealing their jobs. The government's response was swift and brutal. The Frame-Breaking Act made destroying industrial machinery a capital offense. Luddites caught damaging knitting frames or textile equipment were hanged. Not for murder, not for assault, for breaking machines. The message was clear: industrial progress was more valuable than human life. In 1813, 17 men were executed in York for Luddism. They died because they broke equipment that was replacing their livelihoods. It's capitalism defending itself with the noose, proving that in early industrial Britain, property rights trumped human rights. The machines survived. The workers didn't. 25. The Knights Templar were the most powerful military order in medieval Europe, with vast wealth accumulated from banking and crusading. Then, in 1307, King Philip IV of France had them arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake for heresy. The official charges included worshipping idols and spitting on the cross. The real reason? Philip owed the Templars enormous amounts of money and saw an opportunity to erase his debts while seizing their assets. The Pope dissolved the order and its leaders were executed. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned alive in Paris. The Templars weren't destroyed because they were heretics. They were destroyed because they were creditors. Philip turned religious persecution into debt relief, proving that sometimes the real heresy is lending money to the wrong king. 26. In 1803, a London man named Thomas Millwood was walking through Hammersmith dressed in white work clothes when he was shot and killed. His killer, Francis Smith, believed Millwood was the Hammersmith ghost, a figure that had been terrorizing the neighborhood for weeks. The twist? There actually was someone deliberately dressing as a ghost to scare people. A man named John Graham had been wrapping himself in sheets and frightening locals for fun. But Millwood wasn't him. He was just a plasterer whose white clothes made him look ghostly in the dark. Smith was convicted of murder, though later pardoned. Graham, the actual prankster, faced no serious punishment. So Millwood died because one man thought haunting people was hilarious, and another man decided to play ghost hunter with a shotgun. It's the deadliest case of mistaken costume identity in British history. 27. Mary Blandy was a respectable Englishwoman in the 1750s who fell in love with a man her father disapproved of. Her lover, William Cranstoun, convinced Mary that a certain powder would make her father more agreeable to their marriage. It was, of course, arsenic. Mary gradually poisoned her father, seemingly believing she was just softening his heart. When Frances Blandy died and the truth emerged, Mary was arrested and tried for murder. She went to the gallows in 1752, reportedly asking the executioner not to hang her too high for the sake of modesty. Her last words essentially blamed love for her crime, calling Cranstoun the man who ruined me. Mary Blandy killed her father over a forbidden romance, making her one of history's most tragically love-struck murderers. Romeo and Juliet had nothing on this disaster. 28. Britain's Bloody Code was a legal system that, by the 1800s, recognized over 200 capital offenses. Among the most absurd, stealing a handkerchief. If the handkerchief was worth more than 1 shilling, its theft was a hanging offense. Children as young as 7 were executed under these laws. People died for pickpocketing items we'd barely notice losing today. The logic was that harsh punishment would deter crime, but studies showed it didn't work. Juries often refused to convict because they knew a guilty verdict meant death for trivial theft. The Bloody Code was eventually reformed because even 18th century Britons realized that executing people over pocket squares was insane. But for over a century, a piece of cloth could cost you your life. It's the judicial system at its most disproportionate, where the punishment didn't just not fit the crime, it was absurdly, fatally excessive. 29. Pierre de la Ramée, known as Petrus Ramus, was a 16th century French philosopher who committed the ultimate academic crime. He disagreed with Aristotle. At the time, Aristotelian philosophy was the backbone of university education, endorsed by the church and considered almost sacred truth. Ramus argued that logic should be practical and that Aristotle wasn't infallible. This made him enemies among conservative scholars and Catholic authorities. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, Ramus was murdered, reportedly by academic rivals who used the religious violence as cover to settle intellectual scores. He was stabbed, thrown from a window, and his body was dragged through the streets. Ramus died because he thought Aristotle was overrated. It's the bloodiest peer review in history, proving that in 16th century academia, publishing controversial ideas could literally get you killed. 30. In 1723, Britain passed the Black Act, which created 50 new capital offenses, almost all related to poaching. One of the strangest, being found in a forest with your face blackened or disguised, was punishable by death. The law was aimed at poaching gangs who darkened their faces to avoid identification while hunting illegally on noble estates. But the wording was so broad that simply having a dirty face in the wrong place could theoretically get you executed. Imagine being a charcoal burner who accidentally wandered into protected woods, and suddenly you're facing the gallows because you had soot on your cheeks. The Black Act was eventually repealed, but for decades, it represented one of the harshest property protection laws in English history. Your face could kill you if it was the wrong color in the wrong forest. 31. In medieval and early modern Europe, prophetic dreams about royalty were dangerous territory. If you dreamed that the king would die and told someone about it, you could be charged with treason. The logic was twisted but consistent. Either you were plotting against the crown and disguising your intentions as prophecy, or you were using witchcraft to foresee or cause the king's death. Either way, execution awaited. Several recorded cases exist of people being tried and killed for their dreams alone. No action, no conspiracy, just an unconscious vision that they were foolish enough to share. It's thought crime taken to its most literal extreme, punishing people for what happened in their sleeping minds. Monarchs were so paranoid about threats that even your subconscious could commit treason while you slept. 32. In Nazi Germany, listening to foreign radio broadcasts was a crime called Rundfunkverbrechen, or radio crime. The regime controlled all domestic media and terrified that citizens might hear the truth from the BBC or other outside sources. Those caught tuning into forbidden frequencies could face execution, especially during the war years. Similar policies existed in the Soviet Union and other totalitarian states. Simply twisting a dial to hear news from abroad could cost you your life. The technology of radio, meant to connect people across borders, became a tool of isolation and fear. Governments so dreaded information they couldn't control that they made listening a capital offense. Your ears could betray you. A curious mind could kill you. It's censorship enforced at the point of death, making silence the safest option. 33. Sir Thomas More was one of the most respected men in England, a scholar, lawyer, and Lord Chancellor under Henry VIII. When Henry demanded that everyone recognize him as head of the Church of England, More refused to publicly agree, but also refused to publicly disagree. He stayed silent, hoping neutrality would save him. It didn't. His silence was interpreted as opposition, and in 1535, More was convicted of treason. He was beheaded, his crime essentially being that he wouldn't say words he didn't believe. More could have lied, sworn the oath, and lived comfortably. Instead, he chose death over speaking against his conscience. He was executed for what he wouldn't say, making him perhaps the most principled victim of royal ego in English history. Sometimes silence speaks loudest, and sometimes it gets your head removed. 33 deaths, most of them more absurd than any crime being punished today. But here's what I want to know. Pick one person from this list you'd bring back to life and one executioner or ruler you'd put on trial instead. Drop both names in the comments. I'm genuinely curious who this audience would save and who they'd condemn. Like, if this video made you grateful for modern justice, subscribe if you want more historical insanity.